Good morning, everyone, and can I welcome you to this, the third meeting of the Public Audit Committee of 2026. We have received apologies this morning from our convener, Richard Leonard, and I, as Deputy Convener, will deputise on his behalf. We've also received apologies from Joe Fitzpatrick, who is unable to join us. However, we are still small but quorate in number, and we do have still quite a lot of business to get through. Agenda item 1 on our agenda is to decide whether the committee will take items 4, 5 and 6 in private. Gentlemen, are we agreed? Agreed. We are agreed. Agenda item 2 this morning is consideration of the report on improving care experience delivering the promise. Our first session this morning gives me the pleasure to welcome our witness, Fiona Duncan, who is the Independent Strategic Advisor to the Promise and is also Chair of the Promise. And I believe, Fiona, you would like to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you very much for the invitation. As you know, I was appointed to chair the Independent Care Review and examine the roots and branches of Scotland's care system. Over 3 years, more than 5,500 people got involved. This included 2,000 members of the paid and the unpaid workforce, and importantly, over 5,500 children, families and care experienced adults who shared their story, which was often the most intimate and traumatic events of their life, and they were listened to really carefully. They did so in the hope that Scotland would do better, recognising that the review couldn't change their lives, but it could make Scotland a better place for the children and families and care experienced adults coming behind them. This wasn't a consultation. The care community was at the heart of the review. They were in the rooms with people who had power over them, who had made decisions about their life, often without their involvement. They bravely challenged the status quo because it wasn't working. They crafted a promise that went beyond systems and policies and processes and instead focuses on love, relationships, respect and experiences. Then in February 2020, when the review concluded, Scotland made the promise. This has secured and sustained cross-party support, as was apparent at last week's debate on the Children, Care Experiences and Service Planning Bill. And dedication to keep the promise is evident all across Scotland every day in a huge range of settings, as reflected in the Audit Scotland report. And my role is to help make sure that that commitment and dedication is translated into decisive action to honour the care community and the promise it crafted and was made to it. The Audit Scotland report acknowledges that the promise is not one single thing, entity, programme or piece of legislation. Instead, it's a universal commitment across public bodies and political parties to deliver change that can be felt by all care experienced people and families in and on the edge of care. This requires collaboration, and nothing at this scale has been attempted before in Scotland. And it's all to achieve something that may appear really simple, that wherever safe to do so, children must stay with their families. And when that's not possible, they must be cared for in a loving environment with loving relationships so that they grow up into adults and fulfil their potential. It's the how that's much more tricky, as it demands public sector reform, whole system and multi-system change, as well as service redesign. The Audit Scotland report illustrates this complexity, and it provides an important contribution to understanding progress, and I'm grateful to Audit Scotland for this. I accept the recommendations, although I do think that they could have gone further, and I'd like to thank you, Convener, for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much for your opening statement. Just to continue, as you ended in your comment there, you will have observed our last session on this subject on the 10th of December, and on the panel we had some of your colleagues from the Promise Scotland, representatives of the Scottish Government, and also COSLA, who were in attendance. They were asked if they accepted wholeheartedly all recommendations and the content of the Audit Scotland report. Just for clarification, do you?
Yes, I do.
You do. When you say you believe that it could have gone further, what do you mean by that?
So, in the same way that the Audit Scotland report acknowledges that the promise isn't a single thing, a single programme or a single entity, and actually they make a really good observation about the report that the Promise Scotland produced into a local perspective. And in that report we acknowledge that we didn't look at the police. In my introduction I acknowledge we don't look at police, we don't look at health, we don't look at justice, we only look at local authorities. And that gives you a really partial picture. It gives you an accurate picture, but it's only part of the picture. It's like taking certain pieces out of a really complicated jigsaw. Those are right, they're just not the whole thing. And I believe, and the Auditor General knows that I believe that this report provided an opportunity to go further and to look at the roles of the many public bodies, voluntary sector organisations, private sector organisations, and really assess what they were doing and how far they had come and what was getting in the way of further progress and what was helping them make the progress that they've made. And that's really where I'm at. I accept completely the recommendations. I guess I just wish that the report had gone further.
Again, so do you mean, sorry, just to be clear about this, when the report could have gone further in its recommendations or in the work that it undertook?
So that's a great question. I guess in the same way as the process of the independent peer review produced a very specific product, 7 reports, the main one being the promise, the process of the performance audit produced a very specific product, and I recognise that that's the purpose of the performance audit. I guess if the process had been able to go further, then the product would have been different.
So, I mean, does that demonstrate perhaps to us a variance in understanding of what the role of Audit Scotland is in this? Is it the role of the Auditor General to go further and not look at the performance audit via established processes? So,
I mean, that was one of the things that I put in my letter to the Auditor General, and it was really based on the conversation that was had in this committee room, I think in 2024, about how the Audit Scotland was going to look at the process. An interesting test case for the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission of how well public service reform has been delivered. So we're thinking carefully about how we shape our approach. I think the question you've just asked is a question I'm hoping to ask the team and to really understand. The promise is a product of a care review, which is a product of a commitment made to the care community based on Scotland's failure to get it right for years and years. And for those of you really familiar with the promise, you'll know that in the 7 years prior to the care review, there were 6 other reviews into how Scotland cared for its children. The team at Audit Scotland are absolutely right when they say not a single entity, not a single programme. There's part of me that wonders whether the performance audit lends itself to something of this scale and this complexity. I don't know the answer to that, but that is a conversation I'm hoping to have with the Auditor General when we meet.
Does that imply, therefore, that Audit Scotland didn't look more broadly enough at the subject matter? Do you think it was too narrow, too focused? Did you think it was too selective or too picky of what it had looked at?
I wouldn't use any of those words, okay, Convener, because they feel like they're critical rather than curious. And I'm curious, not critical. So my job as the independent strategic advisor is to challenge the systems, to ask whether if we have what we have right now in 2030, will that help us answer the question, has the promise been kept, and how will we know the promise has been kept? And I guess I take every opportunity to do that, and to do that in a way that's respectful and courteous, because I don't think any part of this wide operating system that we have that impacts on babies and infants and children and young people and families in and on the edge of the care system and care experienced adults, I don't think any part of that should be excluded from challenge, because if performance audits were telling Scotland what Scotland found out through the care community in 27, 28, 29, 30, and indeed before by the campaigners who'd called for the review, then we wouldn't have needed the review in the first place. So I'm not critical, I'm curious, and I'm keen to have an open conversation with anyone who's willing to have it about whether what we've got right now is going to help get us over the line and help us understand that we've kept the promise.
So you'll be aware that in that last session I asked the panellists, which included your colleagues from the Promise, the Scottish Government and COSLA, whether they believed that we were on track to meet the promise, and the answer was unanimously that we're not. Given that you've been in charge of the Promise for 9 years and prior were involved in its development, do you accept any responsibility for that?
Yeah, I do. I think we're all responsible for that. I don't think any one person. I mean, convener, you'll expect me to say this, but if I had the power and the ability to make sure that the promise was kept everywhere, every day, to everybody, I would do that. I continue to do my level best. I operate without any powers. I am an advisor. People can choose to take or leave my advice. And I try and I'm invited into places where there are problems that remain unsolved so that I can get alongside people and help figure out what good looks like. The other side of your question is we're sitting here 5 years down the line talking about it. We've got 5 years to go. We've got 4 years and 11 months to go. The promise can still be kept if every single individual and institution played their part. And it's unusual. Again, the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission said in the report and indeed at the evidence session on the 5th of November that this level of determination and commitment is really unusual. And we've sustained it despite the pandemic, despite the cost of living crisis. So it's every day we don't do what needs to be done, it's going to get harder. But that doesn't mean that we cannot get over the line.
The report was fairly critical, though, wasn't it? I mean, the Auditor General highlighted a number of key issues that where progress clearly was not being made, which is the point of a performance audit. He talked about issues around governance and accountability, data, measuring and reporting, the resources that would be required, the governance frameworks and the clear lack of lines of accountability and oversight, amongst others. It was a robust report, to say the least. So clearly, the Auditor General is identifying that things are not so well. And you say we are halfway through the delivery period for the promise. It isn't really a good sign, is it?
I think a lot of the things that appear in the report are being worked on. So they were identified. They were also, many of them were identified by the Care Review, and they are being worked on. I think one of the tensions that exists is we're trying to unpick deep-rooted systemic problems that have been designed and are delivered by humans, so can be redesigned and redelivered by humans. And this comes from years upon years upon years upon years of legislation and policy and governance, and all of that needs unravelled. So you mentioned data. Historically, Scotland measured in the care system the data that mattered to the system. So it was the system and setting, it wasn't the experience and outcome. So for example, and this isn't the case anymore, so this is progress. We are not there yet, but we are making progress. For example, the care inspectorate might have come into this room and checked it was well lit and well ventilated and there was no trip hazards. But they wouldn't check if I was okay, how I was feeling about this, whether I felt loved or respected or safe. So in order to get to the point where we have a set of measures that looks at national progress and outcomes, looks at local delivery, so organisations that are doing what they need to do, and looks at those organisations in between, all the NDPBs across all the sectors, whether that's justice, whether that's health, whether that's housing, whether that's education, and critically measures how people are feeling and what their experiences are. Until we get there, we won't have the right data. We're making progress to get there, but we're not there yet. And convener, I think it's that example has taken us longer than we anticipated because it's got incredibly deep roots. And on Monday at the University of Glasgow Centre for Public Policy event, a chief exec of a local authority said they were reporting against 160 data sets around different areas, and we don't know what happens with some of that data. We don't know how it's used. So there's a lot of questions to be asked about the layer upon layer upon layer. I could go into reporting and governance and money and give you similar examples. But the final point I'll make is so much of this change has to happen in a certain sequence. So there's a question about whether policy cohesion will deliver pooled budgets, or whether you need to demonstrate through data that the policies that government have are impacting the same people. And I'm really glad to be here today, and I think this is an important conversation because Parliament plays a critical role in all of this. At the end of the Cure Review, there were 44 pieces of legislation, 19 pieces of secondary legislation and 3 international conventions. There's more than that now. So there's a job from the sort of source of the pipeline, Parliament and government, right through to the delivery end of the pipeline. And all of that needs unblocked and untangled.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, and we are grateful for you coming to speak to us this morning as we undertake our work on this issue, important issue. Well, I do want to just backtrack a slight second, just to get my head around where you believe you fit into this equation, because on one hand, I believe, and I'll check the official report, but you said that it's your job as an independent advisor to advise people. It's up to them to deliver, essentially. So you're acting in an advisory position, and therefore other people need to pull their weight and do their bit in order for this to all work, and I understand that. But on the other hand, you are, I understand, chair of the promise, so that one assumes the public would expect that to come with a level of accountability and responsibility for the overall delivery of it. So is there a conflict there that on one hand you're saying it's for other, you're simply there just to advise people to get on with the job, when actually you're in charge of the job?
Yeah, so I took the unusual step last November of publishing my work programme. I set out an 18-month work programme, and it builds on the specification of my ministerial appointment, which has 3 functions. And I also took account of the aspects in the report and in the Auditor General's report that referred to me. I wanted to be transparent about how I was responding to that. I want to be transparent about what I do, and I think accountability is really important. I consider myself accountable to the care community. That's who the promise was made to. Obviously, I recognise there's a line of accountability here as well, and I respect that, but ultimately the people who will decide whether I have done a good job or not are members of the care community. So the 3 functions that I have in the ministerial appointment are strategy, delivery and relationships. And the delivery aspect of that function falls really in 2 places. One is via the Promise Scotland, and one is via the organisations I'm working alongside to help support them and give them advice on delivery. And we've called them the pace setters, because the people that I'm working alongside and the institutions I'm working alongside are the folk who are trying new things, they're trying to overcome the systemic problems. So as I said earlier, I operate independently of the system that will continue long after 2030, with no powers and without fear or favour, which is why the relationships aspect is really important. I'm completely committed to my own obsolescence, and the Promise Scotland is completely committed to its obsolescence. We don't want to build ourselves into the system, we want to put ourselves out of business so that the promise is kept. So on page 15 of my work programme, we're very clear about the responsibilities that I have under, in terms of my duties, which are governed by the Companies Act, what I do. So I'm governed by the governing documents of the organisation. I chair the quarterly board meetings, I chair the annual general meeting and the annual strategy meeting, and that's where we invite the permanent secretary. We optimise the effectiveness of the board through recruitment and through its delivery. We have developed a glide path towards our obsolescence, and I provide advice, support and challenge to the Chief Exec and the Promise Scotland team, which shares the same vision as I do, which is the promise being kept by 2030.
It's interesting you say that your 3 key tenets in your role as chair of the promise is the strategy for the promise, the delivery of the promise and the relationships. Is that correct? Just to clarify, that's your understanding of... That's
what's in my ministerial appointment. So strategy is not strategy for the Promise Scotland, it's strategy for Scotland. So under my strategic priorities, I have sustained alignment to government priorities. I try and build on the progress that's been made and the positive change. I've supported the development of Plan 24 to 30, so we're setting the expectations not of what now, but what next. I'm endeavouring to solve some of the problems that you referred to earlier and that have been referred to in the report. And we've been developing tools to try and help people figure out ways to do things differently. Then I've got my 2 delivery mechanisms, and then I've got 5 relationship priorities.
But I guess my point being is that given that wide remit, being the chair by default, presumably is the person who ultimately all lines lead to in this, given the issues that have been identified in the Audit Scotland report, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're not taking responsibility for any of those failures. Or if you do, which of them do you take responsibility for?
So just to be clear, I chair the board of the Promise Scotland, and that is a board of independent non-executive directors. And we have a very specific role and responsibility, which is set out by governing documents and the Companies Act. And all of this, including the minutes, are in the public domain. It's all available online on the Promise Scotland's website. So you're asking me which of the governance data reporting and money...
Which of the issues identified by the Auditor General do you personally take responsibility for?
So I'm working on all of those. And as I said earlier, we've got 4 years, 11 months to go. They're a work in progress. I wouldn't characterise them as a failure. I would characterise them as a work in progress. Okay. I am enormously impatient for change. I have never and will never lose sight of the fact that I made the promise to, and that every day we don't do our level best for that promise to be kept would be a day wasted, in my view. So there's nothing in this report or that you've said this morning that I don't take really seriously and that I don't recognise that I play a critical role in, and that comes with responsibility.
Indeed. Mr Simpson, do you have some questions?
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. And just for transparency, Fiona, we did meet at the event that you've referenced on Monday at Glasgow University, and you introduced yourself to me, which was good of you, and I think you possibly did the same with the convener. So can I just ask you, do you think the promise is going to be met?
So in my opening remarks, I was clear what is meant by the promise being kept. Where children are safe, they'll stay in their families. Where they can't stay with their families, they'll grow up in loving environments with good relationships, and they'll grow on, and then they'll go on to thrive as adults and fulfil their potential. Do I think that Scotland can get to a point by 2030 when that is the norm? And do I think we get to a point by 2030 when we stop sitting in rooms like this talking about the promise being a special thing that Scotland has made but hasn't yet kept, and it just become business as usual? I think it's entirely possible for all of the custodians of all of the systems to do their part, and I think it's entirely possible for us to challenge the culture and for us to ensure the money flows effectively. So I think we haven't got a day to lose, but I still think it is within our grasp. But we've done the easy stuff. You know, the easy change has happened. We're in the really difficult stuff now. We're in the stuff that hasn't been done before, like the data point that the convener made. And I don't think that's necessarily going to be easy, and that's not just the actual process of doing it. That's the process of bringing people on board and helping them understand what they have to change. I know that I'm giving you an incredibly long answer to what could be a super short question. I still believe it is possible.
But challenging.
Incredibly challenging.
So more likely, I mean, my reading of the situation is it's more likely that we won't get there by 2030.
Well, I'm not willing to give up hope.
Okay. I mean, it's all right having hope, but there's got to be realism as well.
I think it is a realistic hope.
Okay. Right. So you've sent, there's a couple of letters that you've sent in. I just want to ask you about them. So if I can ask you about the letter that you sent to the Auditor General on the 4th of September last year. Because there were some comments in there that we've not really seen comments like this before directed at the Auditor General. So have you got the letter?
I do, yes.
Okay. So there's a section in there where it says, and this is on the second page, it says, as it stands, the lead recommendation in the clearance draft, which you'd been sent, creates a significant and entirely unnecessary risk to children, families and care experienced adults. Can you explain why you said that?
I can. I'd just like to reiterate that I sent this letter in the hope, in recognition that this is a moment in time where you get one opportunity to engage in something like this, and that my job is to take it. The recommendation, and I'll read it to you, didn't appear in the final draft. It appeared in the clearance draft, and I am very grateful that it didn't appear in the final draft. It says, the Scottish Government should carry out a transparent appraisal of the deliverability of the remaining work to deliver the promise by 2030. So my view was that if that appraisal went ahead, it came with some really significant risks. Chiefly that by placing the responsibility for carrying out an appraisal on the promise, which has been written and accepted, and we're 5 years down the line into delivery, placing responsibility to rewrite this with the one organisation that's got lead responsibility, quite significant responsibility for delivery, could result in a promise which was no longer recognised by the care community. It wasn't the promise crafted by them, and it wasn't the promise made to them. Indeed, it could have resulted in a promise that was considerably easier to keep. I think it would also have diverted resources, because it would have required officials to spend time going through all the calls to action in the promise and appraising where they were at and whether they could be achieved or what they needed to look like. They could have been diluted. I also think that diversion of resourcing would have resulted in a pause of the progress that we need government to make and the activity that we need them to do. I think another risk would be, and we saw this in the National Care Service, that when there is a conversation taking place about will this recommendation, will this conclusion stay, or will it go, or will it change, the organisations working at the front end of delivery take that uncertainty and as a result, it can create inertia. They could legitimately ask themselves, why would we continue doing this if it might change or might get rubbed out? So I felt that any rewrite of the commitments in the promise and or delay to making improvements in the lives of children, families and care experienced adults were really significant risks.
Just read that recommendation out again, if you would.
I don't have the clearance draft with me. I have a note of what I understand is in the clearance draft. I did have a copy of the clearance draft.
Well, so you just read it out.
The Scottish Government should carry out a transparent appraisal of the deliverability of the remaining work to deliver the promise by 2030.
Okay. And if we look at what actually appeared, the Auditor General is saying the Government, COSLA, with support from the Promise Scotland, should work together to identify where resources need to be targeted to deliver the promise. That's basically the same thing.
I don't think it is the same.
In different words.
I don't think it is the same thing.
Well, it's carrying out an appraisal. So an appraisal is seeing where you are, essentially, and that's what the Auditor General is doing there. How does carrying out an appraisal, I just fail to see how doing that piece of work, however you word it, can put children, families and care experienced adults at risk. Surely it's something that you should be doing on an ongoing basis.
So I think what this boils down to is whether you think that an appraisal of deliverability or consideration of how to resource are the same thing or not. And my concern was that if you appraise deliverability and you say, well, that's going to be really hard to deliver, so we are now not going to deliver it, you could change the promise beyond recognition. And I don't think that's the same as work together to identify where resources are needed and need to be targeted. I think it offers a greater option to say we've appraised deliverability and we've decided that we can't deliver or we won't deliver. I think that's different to where do you need resources to deliver.
But surely an appraisal is assessing where you are at that point in time, and you could conclude, well, actually, we're not on track. But that doesn't mean you stop.
So I think Mr Simpson will never know, because the recommendation didn't appear in the final draft, and I'm pleased it didn't, because I think there were risks associated with it, as I set out.
Well, I would argue that what actually appeared is very, very similar. And it's just a different form of words. And actually, if you read the Auditor General's reports on a variety of subjects, he often makes a very similar recommendation to organisations. Check on progress, report back. He'll give people 6 months or 12 months, and that's what he's done here. This is all quite normal. Would you not accept that just the wording, your wording, is a bit over the top, and the wording is creating unnecessary risk? Would you accept, with the benefit of hindsight, that maybe you could have reworded that, as you asked the Auditor General to do?
So I think, of course, I could have reworded it. I don't know if I would have reworded it, because I felt that we were at an inflection point where I'm very conscious of the power of the Auditor General, and I'm really conscious of the impact of the reports that they produce and the implications that come with them. And so I interpreted those words differently to how you've interpreted them. And I guess I went to the possibility of a worst case scenario and felt that I needed to be clear in my concerns.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about another sentence.
Okay.
It's near the end of the letter,
Okay.
where you say, at worst, the report could derail Scotland's progress towards keeping the promise. Now, we did ask about that in the last session, the previous session that we had on this. But how can a report from the Auditor General derail Scotland's progress towards keeping the promise?
So again, I'm glad to be here so that you can hold me to account and challenge me on my language and my approach. And I wrote this letter in the interests of continuing what I think has been a good relationship with colleagues at Audit Scotland and the Auditor General. I guess I go back to the point I made a moment ago. If my interpretation of carry out a transparent appraisal of the deliverability of the remaining work if my interpretation of the worst case scenario had played out, then I felt there was a significant risk that at a point where we have to up the pace and increase the momentum and do more by more people, that this recommendation could take us off that track. Simply through the things that I said a moment ago, giving principal responsibility to one institution that's responsible for keeping the promise, diverting resources away, creating inertia within the system and running the risk that it didn't look anything like a promise anymore. Looked like a government commitment as opposed to a promise that was written by 5,500 people, over 3,500 of them were children, young people. Care experienced adults and families on the edge of care. That's who the promise was made to, and that's who crafted the promise. And that is the group that I think, if there was to be any transparent appraisal, that should be the group that are appraising the promise.
But it's just the phrase that you've used, that the report could derail the progress. I mean, the report is essentially an analysis of where we are, how the promise is going, Whether we're on track, I mean, it's far more detailed than that. But in summary, that's what it is. And that's what the Auditor General does. That in itself, that process, is hardly going to derail anything, is it? Surely it's more helpful than a hindrance.
It wasn't the process that I felt could of a performance audit. It was the risk within that final product. It was that form of words that I felt, if the worst case scenario had played out, we could end up derailing Scotland.
But surely people, you know, if they'd seen the original draft, or even the final version, the people involved in the promise are not. They're not going to suddenly down tools and stop work, are they?
So I don't think it's. I think the inertia, as a consequence of the uncertainty around the care service, people weren't downing tools because they were looking for an opportunity not to keep the promise. It goes back to that point I was making a moment ago about the pipeline between Parliament and government and leaders, and there are folk at all stages in that pipeline who are making decisions about how to allocate resources, about what the priorities are. And if there is a hiatus where government are appraising the deliverability of certain things, that would encourage people to say, well, until we know what government thinks, we probably shouldn't be doing any more of this, or we don't need to drive this further forward until we understand at what point it's going to stop. So I think it can create, well, I know it can create chaos and uncertainty and a hiatus, because that is what happened during the National Care Service consultation.
Okay, we'll have to agree to disagree on that, which is fine. I just want to ask you about one more thing. Again, the same letter where you mentioned that you asked to get more involved in supporting the Audit Scotland team, and you accept that's not the usual process. I mean, it isn't. Were you trying to steer Audit Scotland at that point? Were you hoping that's what greater involvement might do?
So I suppose there's a few things. I wanted to share with Audit Scotland what I had learned about what was getting in the way of change, and what I had learned about what was helping. So an example might be the conversations around the whole family wellbeing fund. And you know, in the report, the work that I had been doing on a sort of strategic investment and disinvestment model was mentioned in the report, and I was conscious that there was a potential conflict between short-term siloed fragmented funding and the intended design of the whole family wellbeing fund, which was a pot of money over a period of time, and yet in both situations they were getting in the way. So you see here that the team at the Auditor General and his team identified challenges with spending that 500 million whole family wellbeing fund, but also identified challenges with spending short-term siloed money. I wanted to have conversations with them about what I understood were some of the challenges and some of the solutions that we had sought to put in place in different institutions and organisations alongside people. And I wanted to share what I knew to see whether it would be useful for them in terms of their understanding of what was working and what was getting in the way. So that was my intent. I recognised that it was unlikely to happen. I'd asked colleagues within Audit Scotland if I could get involved, and they'd said no. So I thought, and it goes back to the point I made a moment ago, if I have a moment in time where I can get involved and possibly help Scotland have a better understanding, then I'm going to take it. So, yeah, I respect the independence of the Accounts Commission and Audit Scotland and their need to do their job independently, but I did think it was worth a try.
Yeah, it was probably worth a try.
I think it's all got to be worth a try.
Right. Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. Mr Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. During the evidence session on the 10th of December, Fraser McKinlay explained to the committee that those responsible for delivering the promise may have taken the recommendation to review things as a signal to stop what they were doing, and in turn to allow some inertia to creep into the system and derail progress. Would you not say it's the responsibility of those tasked with leading the delivery of the work to ensure that that doesn't happen, rather than the onus being on the Auditor General to adapt his recommendations?
So I suppose I go back to the point I made a moment ago. I think it's a responsibility on all of us. I mean, I am glad that that risk didn't end up, that recommendation didn't end up in the report, and that risk didn't end up being a live risk, because, and it goes back to the point that the convener made, I am an advisor, I am not a decision maker, so I cannot insist that organisations don't make the decision that they might make. So is it the responsibility of those leading? I think it's the responsibility of those leading delivery, but it's the responsibility of everyone else too, who is delivering or who has got a role or a remit or a statutory duty or corporate parenting responsibilities. I don't think responsibility sits with any one individual.
That seems to be a bit of a recipe for confusion and lack of activity. I mean, the concern here is who took a decision, if they took the decision, who took responsibility for allowing this to slow down or indeed stop. And if it did happen, who is responsible for getting it moving again?
Can you help me understand your question?
The point I'm trying to make is that someone somewhere is responsible. It can't just be a sort of diffuse responsibility that sort of magically comes together.
I understand. You're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. And at every point, there is somebody who is responsible for taking a decision about whether. So let's go back to the National Care Service, because I think it's a example within living memory, and it's an example of when this happened. There was a period of time where there was uncertainty about whether children's services would be in the scope of the National Care Service. During that time, the organisations with responsibility for children's services, local authorities, didn't know whether the work that they were going to do was going to be transferred to another body, another institution, or whether another body or institution was going to be taking some of the big decisions. So for that period, there were people who took decisions to invest differently or to invest in something else, or not to build something or to build something else, because that was their decision to take. And again, Mr. Beattie, you know this very well. In any set of decisions, there is a line of accountability. So that might be a decision that was helped shaped by a finance director, it might be helped shaped by elected members, it might be helped shaped by the chief exec and their senior team. So you're absolutely right, there are people that take responsibility. So I think your question is, should it have been the responsibility of the people tasked with leading the promise, delivery of the promise? Then yes, I agree with that. The people, and I guess I am one of those people responsible for leading the promise, but in the same way as the Auditor General said it's not a single entity or policy, I am not the only person responsible in Scotland for making sure that the promise is kept. The promise was made by an army of people, and that army of people all have their own responsibility to keep the promise.
Still sounds a bit hit and miss to me. Do you agree that the recommendation to review was regarded as a signal to either stop or at least slow down what people were doing?
I think the recommendation that isn't in the final report but was in the clearance draft about giving government responsibility to appraise the deliverability could have been a signal. I think it would have been a signal for people to stop or slow down.
And you think that's what happened?
It didn't appear in the final report, so I don't think it's what happened.
I mean, I was asking your opinion, obviously, rather than what's in a report. Do you believe that this review was taken as a signal to slow everything down or indeed stop?
So because the review has never been called for, unless you're referring to the work together to identify where resources need to be targeted, I don't think that's been given. I don't think that's a signal to stop, no.
Okay. Just to move on, in your letter to the Auditor General, you stated that, or you made a comment that you have observed the implementation gap between political ambition and how things are actually delivered. Now, it's the role of the Auditor General to identify these gaps and draw them to this committee's attention. Scrutinise these issues is an important part of our work. Are you saying that the Auditor General's assessment of delivery against the promise is inaccurate?
No, I'm not. And my letter to the Auditor General says, you, Auditor General, have observed the implementation gap between political ambition and how things are actually delivered. So I'm recognising that he's observed that. So earlier when I was talking about the sort of jigsaw puzzle of the promise and the complexity, you know, it's 26 out of 43 government directorates, 49 out of 117 policy areas. It is 100 plus organisations that have some sort of statutory duty or responsibility. What I'm saying is that this report provides really valuable and additional context. But what I'm also saying is it is one piece of the jigsaw puzzle. It is not the entire picture.
It's clear that from your point of view, from raising this point, you have a concern between the obvious worthy political ambitions to achieve what everybody's looking at. But then this question of how they're delivered. Do you believe there's a problem in how they're being delivered, how the promise is being delivered?
So I think that we lost time. 43 days after the promise was made, we went into lockdown. There was a global pandemic, and one of the reports that I produced at the end of the Care Review is called The Plan, and we intended that we would spend a transition year, where we would archive the materials of the Care Review so that all the children and young people and families and care experienced adults who shared their story with us, they knew their story was banked away. But we also have had cost of living crisis, so we didn't get folk in a room, and we didn't design the plan the way we intended to design the plan, and we lost momentum. So, and that goes to Mr. Simpson's point. I think that we are behind schedule, and I think that we have to increase the pace. So, and I don't think it's any one individual or organisation's responsibility. So your question about do I have concerns about how it's been delivered, I think that we're making progress. I actually think that since the Auditor General's report was published, a lot of progress has been made on Plan 24 to 30, the promised story of progress. We've achieved a lot of the things that the Auditor General hoped to see happen. So I think we're probably at a point now, and we were at a point at the beginning of this year with 5 full years to go, where we have never been clearer about what has to happen. We've never been clearer about who's responsible for doing it. We've never been clearer about when it has to be done, and about what good looks like, and about the starting point. I think that we have an opportunity now to move a lot faster. And I think that my job is to try and help people get there rather than criticise people for not getting there.
I hear what you're saying, but that's a little bit different from observing an implementation gap between political ambition and how things are actually delivered. You're looking at how things are actually delivered. What about this gap between the political ambition and the delivery?
So my letter is quoting back to the Auditor General his words. He's observed the implementation gap between political ambition and how things are actually delivered. And I think what he and his colleagues at Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission do remarkably well is raise some of those issues in the variety of reports that they produce. So I'm saying to him, I know that you, Auditor General, have observed this implementation gap.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Commissioner.
Thank you. Mr Beattie, I do have some supplementary questions, if you don't mind, in the short time we have left. Listening to the session that we've had, and I'm grateful for your responses thus far, but I can't speak on behalf of the whole committee, but I do feel there is a general sense of frustration that we don't seem to be getting to the bottom, and maybe we just need to be a bit more frank with each other in this session about whose job it is to deliver the promise. Because if it's not you as chair of the board, if it's not chair of the oversight committee, if it's not a director general in some Scottish Government department, ultimately, who is responsible for producing a plan, assigning people to deliver the plan, and assigning the budget necessary for that plan to succeed?
If there was a simple answer to that, if there was one person who was responsible, who held all the power and all the control and could make all of the things happen, then I think that they would be sitting here in front of you. I don't have that level of power. I offer advice, but one of the things which, and I know you met David Anderson, and you're very familiar with the third Oversight Board report. In that report, there is an acknowledgement that I took responsibility for Plan 24 to 30. So, Mr Green, I was surprised that at the end of a review, and I do think this was partly COVID specific, but when I produced these documents, I figured that there would be a process for these documents to be turned into a delivery plan. And in the absence of that, we produced Plan 21 to 24 and we published it in March. It was a suboptimal process. You've heard my interest in process and product and the relationship between the two, because we didn't get people in rooms and we weren't planning collectively.
So just you produced this document. I don't know what it is you're waving at me, but
it's the promise.
Lovely. So who do you think should have taken that piece of work that I'm sure you're very proud of, and there was a lot went into it? Who should have turned that into an action plan? Again, it goes back to my original question, whose job it is to implement the advice that you've given them? So
I have two answers to that, because they're slightly different questions. I think that there is the promise was accepted in full across Parliament. So I guess my question back to you would be, if Parliament accepts something, Parliament accepts responsibility for doing something in full, then who does become responsible for figuring out how to deliver that? Does it then go to government? Does it then go to the people who are at the delivery end? And the second part of I don't know the answer to that, but I have taken responsibility in the absence of somebody holding the pen. We had hundreds of organisations across, I think, about 25 sectors and across all of the systems that I've mentioned taking part. We drew content from their plans and we've driven content into their plans, so that Plan 24 to 30 is now more comprehensive than it's ever been, and is Scotland's route map to keeping the promise. So I've taken responsibility for doing that, and I've worked with the team at the Promise Scotland to do the work necessary in order for that plan to have been updated. But to answer your second question about advice, and this really probably reflects why I'm here today, I believe that my job is to give advice to anyone who has any role or responsibility in and around keeping the promise. And I include the Auditor General in that. I am conscious of the unique powers and the unique access that he has and the impact that his reports have. So for all of the organisations and institutions and individuals that have a responsibility, I make myself present in their lives and offer them advice. I cannot always make them take it.
So it sounds to me like you know, with the best will in the world, you can produce documents with advice and strategise and come up with ideas and tell people what they ought to be doing, but ultimately you can't make them do anything. And if they fail to deliver, which in some areas we clearly have evidence of failure to deliver what's necessary to make the promise happen, that's outside of your control. Do you feel you're perhaps unfairly taking the flak for the lack of progress on the promise?
No, I don't feel it's unfair. I've taken this role and I've taken on the responsibility. I said in my opening remarks, and again I think it's reflected in this report, the answer here is collaboration. That when you have collective responsibility, you need collective leadership and collective delivery. And what I haven't done is written a plan in isolation. What I have done is work with the people that have responsibility, whether that's statutory duty or whether it's all the voluntary sector organisations that are keeping the promise every single day. They are often the people who children and young people and families in and on the edge of care trust most, because they can have conversations with them about their circumstances. We've worked with all of them to try and, all the ones that we have engaged to try and build a collaborative plan that everybody owns. So it's not...
But isn't that part of the problem, the fact that everybody owns it, therefore nobody owns it?
Well, so yes and no. The yes part is that that's a risk, but what we've done is...
Well, it's happened. I mean, it clearly has happened. That's what the Audit Scotland report tells us.
Plan 24 to 30 was produced in the summer of 24, and at the end of 2025, we had spent 18 months building new content. So we have literally had hundreds of organisations taking part in this planning process, and what they have done is shared their commitments with us, and what we've done is organise them and sequence them, because so many of these things are interdependent, and what we've done is drive back commitments. Plan 24 to 30 is not a statement of intent, it's a statement of delivery. So it's not just what people say they're going to do, it's what they have to do. We've taken 24, 25 as a baseline for the starting point, not the end of the care review. So we've acknowledged the progress that Scotland has made, and we have 2030 as the hard stop. And there are tabs for every single year, and it's clear who needs to do what by when in order for the promise to be kept. We've been working on that for quite a long time, but again, the Auditor General's report, which surfaced that people need a greater degree of clarity, meant that I think our tone shifted slightly from what are you doing, what can you do, to this is what you need to do. So the advice maybe became slightly more assertive and slightly more instructive, which again, I don't have powers to do, but I'm happy to do.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you said in an earlier comment that what ultimately it needs is somebody who has the power to both legislate, create the policy and attach financial resource to the delivery of the policy. Now, I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong, but isn't that the role of the government?
So, I mean, you know this, the legislation is going through Parliament just now. I've given evidence to the committee responsible for overseeing that legislation. That legislation will result in new policies and new guidance, and it needs to result in a different approach to resourcing, and that is where we're at.
Shall I rephrase the question? Do you think ultimately ministers are in charge of this? Because you haven't specifically and overtly said that in your responses.
So, I guess if we boiled it down to something like that, then the risk would be that the wee boy in Inverness today who is living in a children's home and who maybe isn't going to the school that he usually goes to because he's having to live away from his family for a while, and he's maybe living in a residential home with other children that he doesn't know very well. He's maybe feeling a bit lonely. He's maybe got toothache and doesn't want to tell anybody. He maybe feels he hasn't made friends. That wee boy depends on the person standing in front of him. And that's about Scotland creating an enabling environment so that it's more likely that that person standing in front of them keeps the promise. And that is legislation and policies and guidance. But it's also culture. It is more nuanced than, and it is more complicated than a law. You know, we have, I said earlier, we have over 44 pieces of legislation, over 19 pieces of secondary legislation, and over 3 international conventions already. So I'm unconvinced that the law, I think the law is necessary to create the framework for that change, but I don't think that in and of itself will keep the promise.
But I didn't write the promise. No one in this committee wrote the promise. It was an explicit commitment made by the Scottish Government and the former First Minister of Scotland. So presumably the delivery of the promise and the keeping the promise is the responsibility of the person who made the promise in the first place, isn't it?
So the promise is called the promise for a very specific reason. It is both a commitment that somebody makes and a potential, an indicator of someone's potential. Fiona is a promising ballerina, that was never said about me, but that sense that this is actually somebody's potential to be them. And the promise was crafted through a long period of really comprehensive engagement with over 5,500 people. And although I held the pen on the promise, so much of the content came from the people that the promise was made to. And the promise was made to that group of people not only by the First Minister, but by Parliament, by local authorities, by the police, by health. So the promise was made by a huge number of organisations and individuals, and it's on all of them to keep the promise.
Okay, my last question is a simple one, and that's, do you think it is possible for someone who is an independent advisor to ministers or in the promise also able to be chair of the board tasked with delivering the promise?
I do, because I'm governed by... So, the Promise Scotland isn't tasked with delivering the promise. The Promise Scotland is tasked with supporting the delivery of promise. That's quite a different thing. You know, it's a small organisation, 20-odd people committed to its own obsolescence. I am governed by the Companies Act, and chairing the Promise Scotland is one aspect of what I do, as laid out in my work plan. I give advice to ministers, but I give advice to anyone else who I think needs it.
Okay. Unless there are any other questions from the committee? No. Okay, we shall pause there. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming in this morning to give evidence and add to our evidence gathering on this issue. I will now move the meeting shortly into a short suspension whilst we allow for a change of witnesses as we move on to the next agenda item.
Thank you. Thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back to committee members. And agenda item 3 is consideration of the report on delayed discharges, a symptom of the challenges facing health and social care, and also the briefing on community health and social care performance 2025, which has been submitted to us by Audit Scotland. Can I welcome our witnesses to this agenda item, starting with Stephen Boyle, the Auditor General for Scotland. Carol Grant is... sorry, just checking the... Calder. Apologies, Miss Calder. Audit Director, Audit Scotland, correct. Mr. Adam, and forgive my pronunciation, but help me out here. Bullo, Audit Manager, Audit Scotland, and Malcolm Bell, that's much easier, member of the Accounts Commission. And you're all very welcome here this morning. Apologies, we are small in number, but we'll do our best to have a good conversation nonetheless around your report, Auditor General. First of all, before you take some questions, I believe you'd like to make an opening statement to us.
Many thanks indeed, Convener. Very good morning to the committee. Convener, as you mentioned, bring 2 reports to the committee this morning. First on delayed discharges and also a second on community health and social care performance. These reports were both published on the 8th of January, prepared by Audit Scotland on behalf of myself and the Accounts Commission. First, the Community Health and Social Care Performance Report, together as an accompanying data output as well. And these build on our Integration Joint Board data tools that set out financial data and then add national performance data. And what they're intended to do is to allow integration authorities and health and social care partnerships to compare their performance to other areas and explore reasons behind differences. And I think you'll note really in both reports that essence of difference is common, so that there is notable regional variation both in terms of performance of integration joint boards and more specifically around delayed discharges across Scotland. In our work on the performance of IGBs, we found that there also continues to be a lack of comprehensive and consistent national performance information about community health and social care demand, workload, quality of care and outcomes. We note that there's a general long-term picture of declining performance and satisfaction. The performance audit focuses on delayed discharges, which has been a long-standing issue across Scotland that perhaps goes without saying that directly impacts upon people and also the flow of patients through Scotland's hospitals. The audit highlights that most patients in Scotland's hospitals are discharged promptly. And despite only 3% of all people discharged from hospital experiencing a delay, each delay has a detrimental impact upon an individual's physical and mental well-being. Delays further impact the flow of patients through hospitals, reducing staffing availability and capacity for other patients. And in 2024-25, this resulted in 11% of hospital beds in Scotland being unnecessarily occupied. The reasons for delayed discharges are complex, and I think hopefully we set that out in the reports. They vary significantly by area, by hospital, and of course by each individual patient. But we've concluded that they are a symptom of the wider challenges across the health and social care system, and we set out that in some detail in the reports. The Scottish Government integration authorities and their partners in NHS boards and Scotland's councils have actively targeted delayed discharges as an issue, and we see evidence of that right up to senior ministerial involvement and oversight of delayed discharges and the results. And we note that this has led to some improvements, but again that variation across the country. The lack of consistent approach to evaluating initiatives makes it therefore difficult to understand their impact. Better analysis and transparency are needed to understand both the costs and impacts of delayed discharges, what's providing better value and outcomes for individuals and ultimately value for money for public spending. Lastly, Convener, Scotland's Population Health Framework, the Health and Social Care Service Renewal Framework and the NHS Operational Improvement Plan all offer opportunities to make progress with the common focus upon prevention. I think I said similar to the committee when we gave evidence to you on the NHS overview in the past couple of weeks. But it's not clear yet how shared accountability and joint decision-making will be achieved, particularly given there is limited reflection of the critical role that social care services will be provided in the delivery of these new strategies and arrangements. Convener, as ever, the Forums will do our utmost to support the committee's evidence this morning, but I'm particularly glad that Malcolm Bell from the Accounts Commission is with me this morning.
Thank you very much, Auditor General. And given the smaller team this morning, you'll all have ample opportunity to participate in the session. Just catch my eye if you'd like to come in on any particular answer, and not everyone should feel the need to answer every question that's posed to the panel. I will start this morning, though, with Mr. Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. I guess first thing I would ask about is paragraph 63 of your report refers to the Scottish Government setting a target for every emergency department in Scotland to have direct access to specialised frailty teams by the summer of 2025. It's in order to support early identification, assessment and management of frailty at the hospital front door. Do you know if that target was met?
I'll certainly come on there. So that target hasn't been met. I think speaking with Scottish Government...
Sorry, just 1 second. The gentleman's microphone, please.
No, I'll just repeat myself there. So that target hasn't been met. The Scottish Government advised that, I think, under the operational improvement plan, it's proved difficult to meet that target. Frailty teams, getting them in place, I think there's been issues with resourcing for that. So I think there was a report produced by Healthcare Improvement Scotland back in November that kind of provided the information on where they were at with the implementation of that. I think the information that, from recollection, there was about 11, I think, boards where kind of targets were in process of being met, but as of that point, the target had not been met.
So that's 11 out of 31.
Oh, sorry, NHS boards, that would be 11 out of 14.
Okay, 11,
yeah.
Yes. So, do we know any further information on that? Do we understand what the plan is to get this back on track? Is there a plan?
Well, I think Healthcare Improvement Scotland have obviously been kind of engaged to look to see how that plan can be kind of seen through, and those kind of those frailty units be implemented across the board.
How robust are these plans, do you think?
Well, I mean, I haven't seen copies of the plan, so I can't comment on those. So
I think it's helpful. Carol, you wanted to comment on that as well, actually, but I think 11 out of 14, I think, is perhaps positive progress in terms of the development of the plans, the recognition of the variety of different approaches that will need to be deployed in order to make. I think ultimately it's about. I think it's a connection to patient flow, Mr. Beattie. That that people receive the right care and services at the right time in the right environment. That sentence has been said for many, many years. But this, I guess, this speaks to the report, is that there have been a great deal of focus on tackling delayed discharges. So that the frailty one's a good example. So diverting people from an emergency department into an environment that's more suitable for their care. That 11 of the 14 territorial health boards have made progress. I think if that setting a target can be indicative of a signal of intent, and most health boards have progressed along those lines. I guess it will be for government, Healthcare Improvement Scotland, and ultimately, I suppose, the Health and Social Care Department of the Scottish Government to take a view as to why there's remaining progress for those three boards. And there might be good reason for that. They might just say, actually, we've already got an alternative in there, we're trying something different. The point I think hopefully comes through in the report is that there are many initiatives that are happening to tackle delayed discharge, but there needs to be a fuller evaluation of these initiatives, what can be best deployed within different parts of Scotland, why they're working, why the money's been spent appropriately, and have that clear plan to tackle this, what feels like a really stubborn issue.
But the main thing is there is progress being made. It's not just been dropped.
I mean, Carol,
So We've mentioned in the report there's 720,000 unnecessary days in hospital, and we know that about 2/3 of those days are taken with people who are over 75. So the focus on frailty is a really important initiative. There is a programme called the Focus on Frailty Programme, and there are 28 emergency admission hospitals in Scotland, of which 15 are signed up to that programme, and 13 of those 15 have got a frailty team in place. Of the other 2 that's in progress, and of the other 15 that are not in the programme, they're also designing and developing their frailty teams. One of the issues around the delay in meeting the target is what constitutes a frailty team. What does it look like? So more clarity is being looked at in those plans about what constitutes a frailty team. And one of the other issues for the delay is recruiting people to those frailty teams. So I would say that it's a very strong commitment. It comes from the data that frailty is a big issue in delayed discharges, and there is ongoing work on that as well.
So we can expect perhaps some variation into what a frailty team is.
We could do. There isn't a clear definition of what a frailty team looks like, but the ambition is that there is discharge planning on admission, that frailty is assessed, that there is a multidisciplinary team approach to the person on admission to understand what their needs might be when it comes to them being clinically ready to leave hospital. So that is the ambition. And as I say, 13 out of the 15 hospitals that are in the Focus on Frailty programme have got frailty teams in place. The other 2 are developing it, and the other 15 out of the 28 hospitals are designing and developing their teams as well. But more clarity on what constitutes a team is being worked on, and one of the issues in getting a team up and ready is a recruitment of people within that team.
Okay, that's good. Just moving on to paragraph 68. Can you tell us a bit more about the variances in the approach to discharge planning across the IAs? And in particular, how are those facing challenges such as workforce shortages, limited resources and varying levels of cooperation, which I think we've heard in the past is a major issue, and joint working, how are they addressing these issues?
So I think it was back in March 2023, the Scottish Government published the Health and Social Care Occupancy and Delayed Discharges Plan, which set it out to standardise, make sure that the standardised process was being followed in order to discharge patients, because they were obviously finding there was a lot of deviation from that at that point. I think what came across through the fieldwork that we completed is that each different area is completely different to the other, and there's no one kind of process that can be applied and followed all the way through, but to follow the basics and to get that right. So they've been applying that, and I think through the discharge without delay kind of case study that we provide in the report, that has tried to standardise that process by setting a planned date of discharge, but doing that through a multidisciplinary kind of team kind of process, and that has helped kind of to set that kind of that target to discharge patients.
I mean, coming down to some of the major issues that have been highlighted, how are they facing workforce shortages, for example, and limited resources, which would be money, I presume? How are they tackling these?
Well, I mean, yes. So with regards to the resources, they're obviously different places have different kind of resource needs and kind of resource gaps. So there can be kind of gaps in kind of physiotherapy, those kind of things. They've obviously gone through a process of trying to recruit, and they're obviously kind of they've had some success in some areas, and others have obviously have not done so. With regard to finances, I'll bring Stephen in.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually I was going to invite Malcolm. Actually, Mr. Beattie, as you know, the Accounts Commission have reported extensively on integration joint boards, particularly some of the financial pressures that integration authorities are experiencing. So, Malcolm, you might want to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, yes, indeed. I mean, I think we have in the finance bulletin of 23 24, we reported on, and specifically on IGB reserves and how these are being continually depleted, often to shore up day-to-day work. So that is a major issue. Also, in terms of resource and staff, it's not just money that can handle that. Some areas, and particularly rural and island areas, are really struggling to attract staff, regardless of what they may be offered in financial terms. So I don't think there's any one issue that can be identified, but there are a number of issues across the regions that are making this a really difficult problem.
If we're talking about IGBs, in the past we've noted issues around the transfer of funds into the sort of primary function. How successful has that been? Has it improved? Is there more money now coming into that area, or is it still being held quite tight by NHS?
I think there's a long way to go to deliver upon, really, I think, the restated ambitions that came through in the strategies of the summer. These are effectively, these strategies are about prevention, so that people don't have to, after a shorter period of time, end up in hospital. That there are many lifelong missions, ambitions to keep people healthy, and then when they do need support and care, that's, as you suggest, in a primary care setting rather than in hospital. But I don't think Scotland has yet moved into that environment where it's been able to deliver upon a preventative model yet. And key to that will be the consideration of where resources are best spent. Is it in the hospital setting? Or I think the consensus would be in agreement that actually moving resources into a community-based model that keeps people healthier outside of hospital for longer. But I think those are the restated ambitions from the strategies in the summer, Mr. Beattie, and you recall from, I think, both in this report and in the NHS overview report, is if those ambitions are to be realised, one of the ways that will to help do so, we'll come up with an implementation plan with the right level of dates and accountability that goes with that. So I'd say that is really the hallmark of this report and some of our earlier reporting. To move to that preventative model requires a clear deliverable plan.
Okay, I'll move on a bit from that. We've talked in previous sessions about best practice and how best practice can be disseminated. In paragraph 74 of your report, you talk about East Ayrshire's Carers Centre and the good practice there. Now, are there any plans to, or have you seen any plans to share that good practice, that collaboration between East Ayrshire Health and the Social Care Partnership and East Ayrshire Carers Centre? It's obviously in connection with supporting unpaid carers, but there's a model there that could be useful at a national level if that is disseminated. Is there a process for it, and is there any sign of it happening?
I'll turn to colleagues in a moment, actually, and Carol might want to say a wee bit more about this particular example. But I think there are many examples across Scotland of good practice, and I wouldn't say that our report captures all of them. Certainly not. There'll be excellent committed work happening across the country. But I think it still supports the conclusion that we make in the report. There's not been enough evaluation or analysis of these wide-ranging initiatives about to really get beneath the skin of why is there such variation in Scotland of delayed discharges and IJB performance. And that's one of our key recommendations. There has to be a more thorough assessment so that we're not stuck in terms of delayed discharges. And I think you can see from a high level, although there's been recent progress and reduction, we're broadly still operating at the level of discharges we were, or delayed discharges before the pandemic. And maybe a good point to bring Carol in, because Carol mentioned the statistic earlier. There's over 700,000 lost bed days in the country, and that's the individual impact. That's people and their families. Again, we only touch on a high level in the report, but the impact of what it means to that individual in terms of conditioning, more likely to be readmitted if they've been delayed. And we make a high-level assessment of some of the financial loss. So we only cover, so we get to a figure, certainly not an insignificant one, of £440 million that it costs the NHS. But it'll be far higher than that in terms of the readmission levels, the impact that it has on patients and their families. So it's some excellent stuff, and I'll bring Carol in to talk more about the East Ayrshire example, and I guess that role of, and then what happens.
Well, I wasn't going to come in on the East Ayrshire example. Maybe Adam can do that, but at risk of repeating what the Auditor General has said, evaluation is key, and transparency. So there is a coordinated effort to meet regularly to support boards to reduce delayed discharge. So a very focused attention on the levels of discharges and the trends across Scotland. The Collaborative Response and Assurance Group meets very frequently to discuss this data, and there are 3 work streams within that group that look at different things. There's a rapid response team that will go into individual boards to look at what's going on and try and disseminate what's going on. There's a work stream that's working specifically around learning disabled and adults with incapacity, about what good practice there is there. And there's a third one, which from the top of my head I can't remember, but I'm sure Adam can supply that information. But what I was going to say is there's not a lot of transparency in a wider system about what's working well. So there is a lot of focused attention with people that are involved in it, but the wider dissemination of good practice, I think the part of the conclusion of our report is there needs to be more evaluation of initiatives, and needs to be more evaluation of the value for money for certain initiatives, and that is transparent, so that resources and effort is focused on the things that work.
Would it be correct to say there's still an element of silos between the different boards, and that is a barrier to transferring good practice across the system?
I think joint working and joint collaboration and decision making is important across the board. We haven't got any evidence to support that there are particular silos, but the variation suggests that things are done differently in different places. And as you've already mentioned, the report says that there is variability about the level of cooperation and engagement across different parts of the country. And it's not just boards, it's boards and integration authorities and councils and third and voluntary sectors, and how they're all working together in a multi-agency approach. So I think joint working and joint decision making, using data that is reliable and being able to share good practice on what is value for money and what works, will support all the boards and all the integration authorities to do the best with the resources that they've got. And currently we're saying there's a lack of evaluation and a lack of transparency about what works.
Okay.
Mr. Beattie, did you want to hear more about East Ayrshire?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so East Ayrshire is a really good example of where flexible commissioning has enabled them to keep those care packages open in order for kind of that individual to eventually, if they are able to get out in a quicker period of time, to not face delay. Because from speaking with a number of other kind of integration authorities during our fieldwork, it does cause a problem, because not having a care package in place is a real barrier to getting them out of hospital. So it is a really good example of where locally something like that can be done. I think there is a flip side to it, though, that there's a careful balance with it as well. But by keeping those funds kind of locked in one place, it prevents other people getting access to them. So it's just, there needs to be some balance that's applied to it. But certainly, I think learning from all these examples, sharing could be improved from it. So.
Thank you. Just to move on to your paragraph 77, you highlight there the use of reserves to address various shortfalls within the system. In your view, how long will IAs be able to continue to use the reserves to address delayed discharges before the reserves become depleted?
I think it's certainly a question for Malcolm and colleagues to express a view on. Actually, and Malcolm, you maybe mentioned it, I'm sure, actually, but I think the Accounts Commission have a report due very soon that will kind of give a further update on the financial position of IJBs and more analysis therein. Malcolm.
We're currently working on a finance report, finance bulletin for IGBs, which will be published, I believe, towards the end of next month in February. But it is clear from previous work we've done that the reserves position in IGBs is worsening. There are a number of IGBs now don't have any contingency reserves left. Our bulletin, finance bulletin 23-24, we reported that reserves in that year decreased by 36% in real terms, adjusting for inflation, and that's a trend that's been continuing. And to be honest, I mean, the use of reserves, if they're being used to change something as an initiative, is a good thing. But when reserves are being used to pay for the day-to-day, that's when it becomes a problem. And I suspect our report later this year will certainly, I suspect, will continue. We'll be reporting that trend is continuing. Thanks.
I could just add a couple of numbers to what Malcolm has just said. So in our last report, we said that total reserves had reduced by 40%. That was in 23-24. But contingency reserves, so that's money that isn't earmarked for other purposes, is almost almost halved. And 9 IJBs at that point didn't hold any contingency reserves. So the report in February will update those figures. But the projected funding gap, so the financial position of IJB, so the use of reserves is an indicator that the financial position is precarious, but the funding gap was projected at 457 million in 24-25. And as I say, you'll get updated information on that in February in the next bulletin.
And let me just ask one final question, which is based on paragraph 86, where you make it clear that the third sector is a key partner in tackling delayed discharges. What steps have been taken to address the negative attitudes towards the third sector that are reported to have undermined effective partnership working?
That's not really been a focus of our work in terms of negative attitudes, but that you're right to say that the third and independent sector are very important in this system in terms of social care provision. And one of the issues that we raise in the Integration Authority Performance Bulletin is the lack of good data. And part of the reason for that is because it's made up of so many different partnerships with multiple different IT systems. So the information, the data that they have, the ability to collaborate is made more difficult by the fact that there's very different governance arrangements and accountability lines there as well. So it's quite a messy picture. But I don't have anything in particular in terms of the negative attitudes that you're asking about, Mr. Beattie.
Simply that in paragraph 88 you did quote the Alliance who highlighted negative attitudes towards the third sector. I just wondered if you'd looked into that at all.
So we're quoting the Alliance in that paragraph, so we haven't done any specific work to find out what's underpinning that.
Okay, because that sounds quite an important area. If there's such a vital component in addressing this problem, if there is a relationship issue, such as is highlighted there, negative attitudes and so on, I can understand that organisational differences and process differences and so on would come into it, but attitudes, as we all know, can colour relationships and have a negative effect.
You're right, and we know, the Alliance's judgment on that is clear from their reporting. I think it speaks to a couple of points. One is about culture, that delayed discharges won't be resolved by government or by councils. They rely upon working collectively with third-party providers, with the NHS, and with patients and their families. So if there is if there's a cultural barrier that really has to be called out and addressed. The committee, I know, for many years has taken an interest in, I think, particularly some of your own questioning, Mr Beattie, on some of the funding arrangements that exist with third-party providers, and we've regularly spoken about the annual allocation and some of the funding uncertainty that third-party providers can experience when dealing with public bodies too. So there are many factors to be overcome, but the point you make is absolutely clear about, that relationships have to be effective in order for what's a rooted problem to be addressed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr Beattie. I'd now like to pass the floor to Mr Simpson.
Yeah, thanks, convener. If I can just start on the money, why is it that the cost of delayed discharges isn't known?
I guess simply there's no single measure of kind of capturing a system-wide position on what this is costing Scotland, what it's being spent on. So through our work, we look to put a figure on that, and where we got to is the £440 million. I mentioned that it's costing the NHS, and that's really an extrapolation of the bed days that are being occupied when it's not medically required to do so for the patient. But I think, as we touched on in the report, there are many other facets of it. So, for somebody who spends a longer time in hospital, we talk about deconditioning it affects to their and we think it's a really important and necessary point to take forward. We make recommendations in the report, Mr Simpson, that more needs to be done by really all the partners involved about what this is costing, the value for money that goes alongside it. And it'd be a really important starting point, actually, to bring clarity to the cost, the opportunity cost that's related to it as well. I think, hopefully make the point clearly enough in the report that the £440 million, it won't be a cash saving necessarily if you tackle this, but it's such precious resource, and the impact that it could have on other patients. We spoke with the committee a couple of weeks ago on the NHS report, and it's touched on in this one too, for example, about some of the challenges in flow through Scotland's hospital, ambulances queuing at A&E, and some of the resultant delays that comes throughout the system. So there is a significant prize on offer, and one that's well known. I mean, throughout this report and the fieldwork that we did, it's absolutely clear there is a focus on resolving delayed discharges, or an ambition to do so. What we hope our report looks to provide is some of the means of better data, better understanding of the costs, and, as Carol rightly mentions, a more thorough analysis of the range of initiatives that are happening.
Mm-hmm. In fact, you mentioned there the impact of somebody staying in hospital where they don't need to be, the impact on them. And I was looking at paragraph 16, where you actually spell that out, where you say that 24 hours in bed can reduce muscle power by 2 to 5%, and up to 20% in 7 days. And that, of course, increases the risk of falls and care needs, and it can lead to dependency and demotivation. So, the risk there is quite obvious, and that in itself could lead to extra costs on the system. If people are getting out of hospital, if they do get out of hospital, and then they have falls, that is an extra cost on the system, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think we're very, very clear. And I would say also, I think NHS and health and social care leaders are absolutely clear on that point too. That it's not for a lack of ambition, I would say, to tackle delayed discharging, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that this has layers of interest, with the CRAG group, the focus of ministers, including the First Minister, on resolving this. But if you bring it right back down, somebody delayed leaving hospital, it absolutely affects their future prospects for recovery and of in a safe, healthy environment. And, and we cite, the sources, as we always do in our reports, and you can see there are multiple examples, page 39 of the evidence that we've gathered. And interestingly, I think that perhaps supports the point I'm trying to make, is that many of these sources are from the government's own documents of why this matters so much.
Just across the page, on page 11, there you've got Exhibit 1, which shows, delayed discharges, they have fluctuated, but the trend is up, certainly since 2020. Why do you think it is going up? Why do you think it has gone up?
Yeah, I think I agree with your assessment of the trend. I think it is. It's a relatively stubborn one. I think there's a range of factors that we mention. Scotland's population is increasing, for a start. So, and also the demographics of Scotland are changing too. So, I'll bring colleagues in some of the detail around that. There is more complexity in the cases that people have. We draw out a hope in the report also that there's variation. So the experience that people have and levels of deprivation, for example, will be a factor. So if you live in a more deprived part of Scotland, you're more likely to be living with longer-term health conditions and flowing through to the impact that can have on your experience of delayed discharge too. We also talk in I suppose, in really the majority of the first section of the report are some of the wider issues about the pressures in the system. There are financial pressures across Scotland's health boards, local authorities, IGBs that we've touched on too. We also go on to say what are some of the barriers? So we make reference, for example, to the role that some of the legal processes around discharge have as part of this process. Power of attorney, guardianship orders also being a necessary component for further consideration about how that part of the system is working. So as ever, it's complicated. There are many factors at play about why people are delayed leaving hospital. We've touched on some of the care package examples too. And I won't repeat myself. I'll try not to, Mr Simpson, about the need for that evaluation of some of the processes and the underlying commitment, which is clearly there. But what you can see, I think, from Exhibit 1 is that really perhaps now for the past 4 years, it's generally a consistent pattern of around 2,000 delayed discharges each period. Clearly, there was a very significant reduction during COVID that perhaps kind of is not one you maybe draw all that many conclusions on, but it looks like we're in a fairly stable position now of that level of discharge and all of the financial and personal cost that comes with that. I'll maybe turn to colleagues. Is there anybody wants to? Carol?
Just to say that if you look at Appendix 1, the variation in boards, there's some significant improvements and some significant deteriorations. There is not a clear pattern. It's really, the variation is very difficult to understand, and I think that's why there is so much focus through the CRAG on trying to understand what's happening in individual boards and what the reasons are. And as the Auditor General said, there's the population element, a burden of health, disease, ageing population, complexity of health needs, the system pressures, finance, workforce, demands on the system. All of that is in the mix. But there is still something in that appendix that is quite interesting around why can there sometimes be really significant improvements and then really significant deteriorations. But it does average out to around about 2,000 each time. So it seems to be almost plateauing. There was a slight reduction just before our report was published, but the November data shows that we're back up to over 2,000 again. So there's some very complicated dynamics at play, I think, behind the individual results for individual boards.
Yeah, I mean, that appendix that you reference, I mean, the figures, they are a bit all over the place, to be honest. So there's no set pattern there. I mean, people can look at it for themselves. But in Exhibit 2, I mean, I'm keen to explore what are the reasons for delayed discharge? And you helpfully set out some of them. And there's no one leading reason really in this. You know, it could be waiting for a care home place. It could be awaiting availability at a high-level specialist facility. You could be waiting on a care package at home. You could be waiting for adaptations to be done in your home. There's all kinds of reasons. But I was struck by, in paragraph 67, and this is really my thinking, if a person is admitted to hospital, the discharge planning process should start immediately. So if you think about it, I mean, you've highlighted that most people who are affected by delayed discharge are aged over 75. So if you've got somebody of that age going into hospital, it shouldn't be too difficult to figure out that they may need a package of care in order to leave. So you'd have thought that the planning should start, as you say, as soon as they get into hospital.
Yeah, I mean, Adam might want to say a bit more about this, actually.
I think that, well, speaking with kind of integration authorities about this when we've done our fieldwork, is that on paper it seems straightforward that that's the case, but the fact is that they may have differing resources, that they're not able to provide the services within that care package. There are examples where carers aren't available, so you'll maybe be able to complete the adaptations at the house to get the person out. Actually, in reality, there's no one actually to go in to see that person in the community to complete those care visits and to check on that person. So, but it varies across all of the regions. I mean, there's no. I think that's one of the things that struck us, is that it's so varied, and it's not one way that you can just focus on one thing. We can do X, Y, and Z, and we'll get this kind of fixed. There's so many different kind of parts to it, but then within that, there's variation of how they're able to deal with it as well.
So I would also just remind the committee and part of the report that people who are delayed with non-complex needs, the average delay is only 10 days. I say only, and that's a significant delay for an individual. But in comparison to adults with incapacity, those delays can be well over 3 months and 6 months as well. I think in those instances, there's the issue that the Auditor General's already mentioned about having power of attorney, and that is not in place for a lot of people. And therefore guardianship order is required, which is a court process, which is very lengthy and it's expensive. So those issues are really causing the very long delays for some people. And what we said in the report, that more needs to be done to promote and provide guidance for people and for proactive targeting of the importance of a power of attorney, say through local partnerships that are dealing with dementia care. So that when people are being diagnosed, that these things are being talked about in advance, rather than this then being an issue when the person is in hospital and not capable of being returned to the home. So for adults with incapacity, it's really quite a significant jump in the amount of time that they are delayed in hospital.
What's the worst delay you've come across?
I'm not sure that we've got information on that, so we'd be looking at averages. So, but anecdotally, you hear on the news that people can be delayed over a year or more.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty
I would
astonishing.
hope that's rare, but
I mean, think of the impact on the actual patient.
we do know that between 35 and 65 people who are adults with incapacity can be delayed over 6 months at any one time. So that
I mean, there's an interesting statistic at page 80, paragraph 82 rather, of the report. We draw on some of the reporting by the Scottish Legal Aid Board in the context of adults with incapacity. Those accounted for 47% of legal aid grants in 24-25, up from just 2% just under 20 years ago. So it's and I think we rightly talk about how this is about older people and frailty, but not solely. Actually, this is also about people at earlier stages of adulthood with perhaps severe and complex needs can also be impacted by delayed discharges. Hospital's not the place that people will live. It should be a period of time for treatment, and actually finding the right package of support, care and suitable accommodation after hospital has to start really at the outset of people's entry into hospital, so planning to get them out of hospital into a suitable homely setting is so important. But I think the point Adam makes is also maybe just to emphasise, Mr Simpson, that the financial pressures are there within IJBs especially, that when somebody enters hospital, there's that risk that the care package stops because of some of those financial pressures. But rather, if for the care package to continue, instead gives the opportunity for earlier discharge, and it's not, and perhaps not the sunk cost that there is a risk that it's perceived to be.
Okay. So you've mentioned some things in your report which may help. So some case studies. One is discharge without delay, which I guess is what we've been talking about. Try to plan when somebody comes into hospital, plan to get them out of hospital into the appropriate setting. Now, discharge without delay is described in your report as a collaborative which meets fortnightly. It has 50 members, covers 11 boards in Scotland. How successful has that been, would you say?
So obviously we say in the report that it was obviously trialled and developed in Tayside. So Tayside kind of spearheaded this process, and it was seen as a positive way to deal with specifically with elderly, more frail patients, as a way of targeting them. And it has had some success within Dundee City. Was one of the case study, the fieldwork areas that we spoke of. They've had real traction with it. It has. I think now the fact that 11 boards have signed up to it have shown that they've obviously seen that it is having an impact, but they're all at varying stages within that of signing up to this discharge without delay process, because they've all got varying resources. You can't just lift and shift it in and it will just work straight away for whichever board or integration authority takes it up. But certainly from the discussions that we've had with the group, it's been a positive step forward, and the Scottish Government's also have said to us that they see it as a positive step, and that's why it's obviously forms part of their their plan for taking it forward, and they're engaged in that collaborative as well.
Right, and the other thing you mentioned is hospital at home, and there's a commitment to expand the number of hospital at home beds to at least 2,000 by December of this year. Are we on track?
So I think in the report we advised that funding has been provided to boards. They had to put in a bid for the funding, and a partial element of that funding was provided to each of the boards. Whether it's on track, I mean, we've got until end of 2026, I think it is, that it's due to be implemented by. So, is it 2006? Yeah, 2006. So, we haven't seen any information from Scottish Government to tell us, to advise us of where they're at with that at the moment. So, but I think Healthcare Improvement Scotland produced a report just providing an update with where that was at the time. So,
but I think the only thing I would add, we touch on this in the report, is it's been promoted as again one of the initiatives to support prevention of delayed discharges, together with some of the funding that you refer to implement it across the country. But we do know that there's not yet been an analysis of its cost effectiveness. As a programme, just at the header above paragraph 51 on the report, both in and of itself, but also its relative success to some of the other initiatives that are happening across the country, features as one of our recommendations, Mr Simpson, for Public Health Scotland and Healthcare Improvement Scotland, considering some of the metrics on the use of the Hospital at Home programme. ultimately just to allow that assessment of, is it working, is it effectiveness, is it a successful model relative to some of the other approaches that are also in play.
I can just come in there. So Healthcare Improvement Scotland, they provided confirmation that between April 2024 and March 2025 it prevented over 15,000 kind of hospital admissions. So it does have its place for those, for all those 15,000 it would have prevented those delays from happening. So it does have its place, but obviously what we're saying is that further evaluation and analysis is required in order to understand the impact it's having against kind of the investment. So.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener.
Thank you very much, Mr Simpson. We've got a short bit of time left, but not too much, although I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. But I'll maybe just ask a few additional questions, Auditor General, if that's okay. I think the most obvious point to make is that this issue of delayed discharge has been flagged by Audit Scotland for over 20 years. My briefing says 2001 was when it was originally brought to an iteration of this committee or Parliament's attention. 2 decades has passed, yet here we are looking at your latest report, and clearly whilst we're seeing some improvement in some health boards, it's still a massive issue. It's still costing the NHS £1 million a day, and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people are still affected by it. And I guess what I can't get my head around is how on earth, after 2 decades of flagging this with government, we're still in this mess. And it's not for you necessarily to answer accountability for decisions that government have or have not made over the years. But what, in your view, is the reason this is still such a big issue?
So you're right. I think when we reference in paragraph 96, I think the report that was produced in 2005, and there is overlap to the conclusions that were reached by our predecessors, and again in today's report with the Accounts Commission. It's a complicated local and national picture in terms of funding environment, workforce, population change. More people living longer, and living longer but with multiple health conditions also. So in some ways it's a measure of success that Scotland's population is growing, and that there have been increases in life expectancy that, with some inevitability, that can lead to people needing more and different types of care as they age. But I think it's probably capturing that the system hasn't evolved in the way that it needed to allow for some of these changes. Some were predictable, some maybe less so, Convener. We know and we've seen that there is no shortage of focus or ambition to change and to resolve delayed discharges. Talked about the CRAG group, talked about the role that ministers are playing, looking to support collaboration, the right levels of accountability. But again, one of the recurring themes from Audit Scotland reports is there needs to be better data to understand how the investment is being made and what it's achieving. And then, on top of that, much clearer implementation planning for initiatives, some of which will be successful, but some not. And for those that are successful, clear evidence-based judgment about can they be replicated across the country, that allows, we hope, for the system to be focused and evolved, continue that collaborative model, but tackle some of these really stubborn issues that are in front of us. Those 3 themes: better and more data, clearer implementation and planning, and more collaboration about what works well and what doesn't, and how you best share best practice. I have to say that's pretty much every report you've ever written since I joined this committee. Why are these such common issues across all areas of policy in government? I mean, it's recurring themes here. Every report says the same thing to us. So there's consistency with some of our reports in terms of those themes. I would never understate that if it was easy, it would just get done, wouldn't it? So there is complexity in this. There's prioritisation of investment that will be needed. So I can make recommendations about need better data, more evaluation, but some of that will take. Some of it will take more money, will take resources or people to focus upon that. Our recommendations are only that, as the committee knows. So they're certainly not powers of intervention. They're an independent assessment of what we think will help better public spending and better outcomes from the delivery of public services. But again, ultimately, there's an important role for this committee that it plays in terms of the evidence taking that you do and can choose to do on particular topics to support that level of accountability too. Perhaps the difference, I think, maybe from this report and some of the others is that we have seen real evidence, as I've mentioned a couple of times, of a desire to tackle this, involvement of officials from across different public bodies, that ambition to work collaboratively. So I think we're further down the line than we maybe are from some of the other topics that we've reported on to the committee. And we hope that our recommendations, particularly the one about the evaluation of initiatives, allows that level of clarity for decision makers and those implementing them to take those next steps to tackle what, we talk about stubborn issues. I think this is perhaps the best example or worst example perhaps in delivery of public services to be addressed.
I mean, do you think delayed discharge can ever be eliminated? I mean, is it just an impossible ambition? I mean, it can be reduced for sure. There's clearly evidence that when it works well, I think Carol spoke about some of the examples of, good practice, and it can be reduced, but it can never be truly eliminated. Are we just setting ourselves up for failure and trying to fix this problem, or is it just simply baked into the system of the entire health and social care process?
So I don't believe it's a problem that can never be resolved. And I think probably we've got enough evidence from that perhaps those examples of variation. There have been some tremendously successful examples of progress in Scotland on tackling delayed discharges, but the data looks so random as to why is it, what's working well. So that's actually in some ways a very good place to be, because it's not as if the system is scrambling around for how do we tackle this. There's some great examples of where it's worked really well, and many of those are set out in the report. Will it ever be reduced? Probably not. And maybe you wouldn't want it to be entirely reduced, because there's a patient safety element, of course, in some of this, that actually making sure that people are safe and having the right conditions will always take priority over a system that focuses solely on throughput and people kind of leaving Scotland's hospitals. But I think what we do have, we've got an opportunity gap here of getting it down to a level that feels much lower, more manageable and sustainable than we have at the moment.
Yep, I think that's been well iterated in your report. Carol, yes, please.
Would just add to that is that I think what the original question is, it's not changed over 20 years, but the other thing that we've been reporting about for 20 years is the lack of a shift in the balance of care. And I think that will be fundamental to the delayed discharges. And I think we do have an opportunity now, because we do have a public health framework, and we do have a service renewal framework. I think what's missing from those is the implementation plans that the Auditor General has mentioned, but also the reflection and recognition of the important role that social care sector has in this as well. And currently there isn't a huge amount of reflection on that. And what we need to see is how that joint decision making, joint working and joint accountability will be achieved in practice. But I think if we can shift the balance of care, we will see a shift in the delayed discharges too.
That's a good point. Surely, I mean, if someone's medically fit to leave hospital, the doctors don't want them there, the patient doesn't want to be there, their families don't want them to be there, but there's clearly a blockage in what happens next to that patient. And I think Mr Simpson went into some detail about the variety of issues that are causing the blockages. But are you saying that ultimately these are all social care issues? These are all community-based problems that are the responsibility of, for example, IGBs, local councils, the third sector, care homes. There's so many other partners involved in unblocking this that it's hard to see how all this will join up so that we can finally crack this nut?
I'm saying it's a system problem. I'm saying that we see too many people in secondary care, that there needs to be more investment in community care and primary care to avoid unnecessary admissions, to avoid deterioration, so people end up in hospital. So I'm not saying it is a problem for one part of the system, I'm saying it's the whole system. It's shifting that balance. So the dial on that has been very reluctant to budge, and I think that if we can shift investment into primary care and community care, then we will see less of the more acute symptoms, of which delayed discharges is one, in the acute sector.
That's very helpful, and these are questions that we can pose to the government in due course, based on your helpful feedback. I guess the other area we wanted to briefly look at is social care itself, and Adam, I was quite taken by your example. I think it's one of many examples that we get, particularly through casework, of people being unable to access care packages. Now, you mentioned the availability of staff. That certainly is an issue, but there also are clearly issues around the amount of funding available in councils at that local level for packages, and when that money runs out before the end of the financial year, if you're unlucky enough to be a January to March patient and the money's run out, then you're more likely to be stuck in hospital till the beginning of the new financial year and money's unlocked. Is there any evidence of that happening?
No, certainly not from the work that we were doing. We didn't come across that at all. And I guess kind of, there's nothing we've seen. I don't know if Mr. Bell, he's got anything he wants to bring in about kind of funding that they've seen from the Accounts Commission side of it, but certainly during our field work, we haven't. They're obviously having to make difficult decisions about what they're doing, considering eligibility criteria. Those kind of aspects are having to be looked at to see what they can offer to certain patients and changing that criteria. And that certainly did come through in some of the discussion that we had with fieldwork sites, was that they are going to have to consider these, given that finances are stretched as they move into it. So but certainly from our fieldwork, we didn't come across any evidence. But I don't know if Mr. Bill's got anything he wants to add. Or...
I don't think there's an awful lot I can add to that. I mean, we all know that finances are stretched, and councils are no different to that, and certainly eligibility criteria is one area. But I think, we say it, paragraph 97 in the report, that at both a national and a local level, all partners need to work together to be more honest and open about the changes that are needed in order to ensure that health and social care can remain sustainable into the future, given the increase in demands and given the increase in expectation gaps that we have in the system.
Can I just clarify, are all boards signed up to the, I think, is that 11 you mentioned earlier?
Discharge without delay.
Yeah, is that 11 that are signed up to it?
So there are 11 out of the 14 boards are signed up at the point that when we reported on it. So I think that was back in November time. So there were 4 that hadn't. So Lothian have decided to do the Lothian partnership. So they've been spearheading kind of that as a way, but taking elements of discharge without delay and using it. So for some, it just didn't fit their kind of the resources that they had. So, but I think the plan would be to try and roll it out across all boards.
Okay, but are you confident that there's still a national?
Oh, certainly. I mean, there's
charge towards meeting this objective.
We've attended some of the weekly or fortnightly meetings, and kind of the amount of people on there discussing it, and kind of the work that's going into it. It's got kind of it's definitely kind of making progress, I would say. And
just finally, Auditor General, you've made a number of recommendations in your report, and we can read those in black and white, or blue and blue as they are. But I guess what is your overarching message, so that we're not sitting here in 20 years' time? Perhaps it might not be me sitting here, but or yourself, Auditor General. But I think there's a shared desire that this is not an issue that can go on for another 20 years. No, we can't afford the financial or human cost of this carrying on for decades longer. What would be your overarching message to stakeholders to take heed of so that we can avoid that being the case?
I'm grateful for the opportunity, Convener. Actually, you're right. I think none of us would wish to have a never-ending stream of reports or evidence taking on such an important issue. I would reiterate, we are very clear that there is a desire to tackle this. We saw that coming through strongly in our field work with all of the people that we met with. But it's perhaps that range of deep-seated ambition to resolve the issue that's led us to having such a range of different approaches across the country, that's leading to some of the variation. So perhaps dispassionate analysis, people working and accepting that what's working in another area might be well suited to your area, that might not be your initiative that you've created. Getting the right data, evaluating it, continue to work in partnership. Perhaps the themes that you referred to earlier, I think best summarise the nature of the recommendations that we have in today's report. As ever, just to say to the committee, we don't just produce reports and that's them in isolation. We'll continue to follow up progress against that and bring that back to the committee in due course.
That's very much appreciated, Auditor General. I think on that note, we will conclude this item on our agenda. It remains for me to thank yourself, Mr Boyle, Auditor General, Adam, Malcolm and Carol for joining us and for giving evidence to us, which we found extremely helpful. And it's no doubt an issue that the committee and future committees will take a close interest in moving forward. And we also look forward to the Commission report on integrated authorities, which is due out soon as well. We'll keep our eye out for that. I will now move the meeting into private session. Thank you.